Today, I am an official candidate for the Republican nomination.
Welcome to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson, candidate for the Republican nomination for the presidency of the United States. And now, your host for Perspective 88, Yolanda Gaskins.
Welcome. For the next half hour, we'll be discussing some of the economic issues that all Americans want to know about. American voters are faced with an economic crisis. Foreign investors are buying up American business. The welfare system isn't working, and government spending is just out of control. Now, today, my guest will share some of his solutions to those and other crises facing our national economy. Ladies and gentlemen, Pat Robertson.
Thanks, Yolanda.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Oh, we're, of course, talking about the economy today, and you are a businessman, and
That's
you've
right.
got to get us out of this financial, fiscal nightmare that we're facing. How do you propose to do that?
Well, we've got to put in some common sense principles. You know, that's what we need more than anything else. The politicians aren't talking common sense. We had a debate the other day on NBC. And I went up to New Hampshire right afterward. And one of our supporters said, "You know what I saw on that stage?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "I saw 11 politicians and one businessman." We've got to get solutions that are just plain common sense and get away from some of these failed policies of the last 20, 30 years.
And you think operating government like a business is going to work for us?
Well, you know, the average businessman can't raise taxes when he doesn't get enough revenue. He has to cut spending. The Congress doesn't want to do that, but they've got to.
Obviously, they don't want to cut spending. We've got such a tremendous deficit. How are we going to confront that?
I think there's no business in America that can't cut 10%, and there's no way in the world that this government couldn't cut 10% of its $1 trillion budget if it wanted to. That means we could cut $100 billion. And I would, as president, would propose in fiscal year 1989, which would be the first one I would get, I believe, I would like to see a budget with a $100 billion saving limit or spending limit, and then the next year a balanced budget. I think we could do it. Excuse me, it's fiscal year 1990, and then 1991 is the correct year.
Another economic problem, unemployment. It's steadily creeping up again. How are we going to cap that and lower that?
Well, Yolanda, actually, unemployment has been doing very well recently. I was in Keene, New Hampshire not too long ago. They have a 1.9% unemployment rate, which is just staggering. They said we can't. I was walking through a shopping center, and a man said, "Look, I need some help in this haberdashery store. Could you fill in for about an hour?" But they can't hire people. There's so few people available to work. When you get under 6%, you're in pretty good shape. Anything less than 6.4% unemployment is actually very inflationary. So we're down in the 5.8% range, which is about as good you're going to get.
But when you come back into the cities, that's where most of the unemployment is.
Now, that's something else. You're looking there at education. You're looking at a class, especially of young black people who have not been trained how to read and write. They don't have hope. We've got to improve the educational system. We have to give those young people the vocational training they need. We've got to give them useful skills and give them hope. And especially we've got to break that drug trade in the inner cities. That's the thing that is causing the problem. It isn't that the American economy can't handle it, but they are unemployable because they can't read.
Almost all politicians will tell us that they're not going to raise taxes. Then once they're in office, there go the taxes right up. Now, you say you're not going to raise taxes.
Absolutely not. You take the pledge. The marginal tax rates can't go up anymore. That's not the thing. We do have to get tax cheaters to stop cheating. Somebody has said maybe $75 billion or $100 billion a year from people who are cheating on the government. I also think that we could charge some user fees for services the government provides. That's not the same thing as a tax. A doctor friend of mine said that half of all the patients in hospital beds in America were there because of tobacco. Half of all the people in hospital beds had tobacco-related illnesses. Now, I think we might put a user fee on cigarettes to pay for the medical expenses. And the same thing with alcohol. Put a user fee to take care of all those that are sick with various alcohol-related diseases.
That's interesting.
That's
something else. There is so much government waste. I mean, I hope that we can soon see the day when we stop spending thousands of dollars on screwdrivers and things like that. How can we put an end to that?
Take the Pentagon, where they've got those $1,000 screwdrivers and $600 toilet seats. You know, a military man has got essentially the same equipment as a civilian, and his toilet seat requirements are not any different from anybody else's. They really aren't. But they would have 40 pages describing a military toilet seat. And they call that military specifications. They've got 10 pages on how to make chocolate chip cookies. Well, all you've got to do is buy off the shelf. And that's what, instead of what's called buying by military specs, we could conceivably save $8 billion a year by that one little change.
All right, we're talking about the economy today. When we come back, we've got more questions for you, and we've got an audience full of some of the country's top business people that are going to really fire some questions at you. Okay. So Perspective 88 will be right back after this. Perspective 88, and we're talking with Pat Robertson today about some of the economic problems, and we've got an audience full of top business people, and we've got a question from this gentleman. Your name is?
Bert Servas.
And you're with what organization?
Curtis Publishing Company, Indianapolis.
Okay, now what's your question?
Pat, in this morning's Washington Post, no less, 32 economists joined in a statement that if this country did not address its two deficits, both the trade deficit and the budget deficit, that this would result in a worldwide depression of the size and scope and length of the 1930 depression. Would you feel that the gravity of these two problems are that deep? And if so, and as you indicated earlier, how would you address that as president
Thanks,
of this country?
I don't think it's that bad. I think there are alarmists, but I think the thing that worries me more is the fact that in the world we have a $20 trillion debt structure, 10 in this country and 10 overseas. Our imports run about 9–10% of gross national product. Japan's, interestingly enough, runs about 13% of their GNP. And the federal deficit has been running about 5%. Now, that isn't something that will sink us unless we let it continue year after year after year. And that's what's happened. It took us from 1776 until 1981 to accumulate the first trillion in debt. It took us only 5 years, 1981, 1986, to get the second trillion. Now, in 4 years, we're going to add the third $1 trillion of federal debt. It's this accumulation, the exponential curve of debt growth, that is causing the problem. But I do agree that we must get these things under control, but there are three things that would be absolute suicide. Number one, to raise taxes. Number two, to raise tariffs. And number three, to raise interest rates. Now, the Fed, I understand, has been choking off the money supply. The M3 money supply has been in a negative growth for the last 6 or 7 months. And they've got to begin to be more accommodative with money. But At the base of it all, we cannot continue to be a consuming, spending economy. We've got to begin to save, and we have to begin to produce for overseas. But we're not talking about huge amounts. We're talking about a little bit of shift that goes long range, can solve our problems. But if we don't get them under control, we will wind up being like one of the banana republics 10 or 15 years down the road, and it will be a tragic situation for our children and grandchildren.
Here's a question from a man who knows a lot about employment. Your name is?
Bob Snelling.
And you're with what organization?
Snelling and Snelling.
I told you. What is your question?
Pat, you've said from time to time that if we got rid of the welfare programs, social service programs, that the government could write out a check for $15,000 to $20,000 to every needy family in the country. Now, that just sounds great, but how would you go about accomplishing that?
Well, Bob, the actual figure is, that my staff gave me, is that if we gave a check from the federal government to every person to supplement their income and bring them above the poverty line, which let's say it's defined as about $12,300 or so for a family of 4, it would cost us $50 billion a year. And yet, in local, state, and federal welfare programs, we are spending $400 billion a year. So there's an 8-to-1 discrepancy. Now, what I want to do is get people out of this cycle of dependency and despair. I heard of a welfare grandmother who was 28 years old. She had a baby at 13, her baby had a baby at 13, and at 28, all 3 of them. Now, she is a grandmother, and all 3 generations are on welfare. The Chicago Tribune found 4 generations on welfare. We must get a system which reinforces families, brings people to productive employment, and gets them out of this cycle of dependency. Now, that's the key to welfare, and I say the answer to poverty is a job and not a handout.
Our next question is from Jim Norman, and you're with what organization, Jim?
Well, my brother and I have a few automobile dealerships in Florida.
All right. What is your question?
Pat, you don't really believe that you can balance the budget without raising taxes, do you?
You know, I sure do. I don't think I can do it, but given a Congress with the will to do it, I think the answer is to cut out government waste and mismanagement. The Heritage Foundation identified about $121 billion a year that could be saved, some of which is not that tough and difficult to do. Peter Grace in the Grace Commission discovered $433 billion over a 3-year period that could be saved, again without really removing any federal programs. But what is needed is the will of all the people to do it. To raise taxes at this particular time would stifle the economy. It would be a terrible thing that we could not stand. Congress right now, I was just talking to a congressman, as a matter of fact, is voting on some more tax increases. That would, in my estimation, be a tragic mistake. You go back to 1930, and what they did, they raised tariffs, they choked the money supply, and Franklin Roosevelt ran in 1932 on a program of raising taxes. The Democrats don't learn, and unfortunately, some of the Republicans don't learn either. So we just can't do it now. The economy won't stand it.
And we have another question here from?
I'm Ellie Dooner from Atlanta, Georgia.
And you're with what organization?
I'm married, and my husband has a billboard company, and he's also has restaurant chains.
So this lady knows business, too. Here comes a tough one, Pat.
Oh, boy, it is. I heard you several weeks ago on a debate, Pat, and it really concerned me when you and Bush did not agree on something that's really important to my husband, his employees, and my family. And that is, you said that you felt that the Social Security that we have is not really adequate to take care of our children and our employees. And the money that they have put into this for years, perhaps maybe is not as real as what we think it is. I was taught as a child, we can trust the government. And now I'm starting to really worry, and I would really like you to address this issue.
Well, Ellie, that's a great concern, and it's absolutely what I've said was the truth. I met with the Social Security Administrator. I met with other officials, the top-level officials of the Health and Human Services, and here is the truth. Social Security does not have a trust fund. There was a surplus in 1987 fiscal year. That's the fiscal year 1987 that finished up in October, at least September 30th of this year. There was a $20 billion surplus. Every penny of that money, according to what they told me, was spent on covering the federal budget deficit. There is no trust fund. It is merely covered by a government IOU that can only be paid off if taxes are raised on the younger generation after the year 2000. Now, there's going to be a tax increase on Social Security in 1990, $25 billion, another one the next year, $25 billion more. By 1990, anybody earning as much as $50,000 will pay $8,000 in Social Security taxes, 4 from him and 4 for his employer. And even with all those increases, by the year 2015, there will be no more money to pay the next generation without raising taxes some more, maybe up to 23%. Now, we're talking about a very serious thing, and the politicians won't tell it to us straight. Social Security is a transfer tax of money from the productive sector to the retired sector. There is no funding. There is no actuarially sound policies. There is no basis in wealth in it except the full faith and credit of the United States into next generations. And frankly, it's a fraud on the younger taxpayers, and I want to see a private system over the next 40 years. I want to guarantee to the elderly they get their benefits, whatever. I mean, guarantee that. For the younger workers, let them put about 25% of what they now pay into Social Security to the government into private programs, tax-sheltered like IRAs, compulsory, and when they retire, they'll have money that may be $500,000, maybe $1 million, maybe for a couple as much as $2 million. It'll be their money, and they won't be subject to the vagaries of the political process. And I think that's the only honest way to treat younger workers in America.
Pat, we've got lots more questions for you, and we also have questions from the man on the street, so we'll have more when we return. Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. Now, we couldn't squeeze everyone in the studio, so we took our cameras out on the streets.
What are you going to do about ensuring the quality of life for the elderly? What might you do about maybe restoring IRAs to the average working man?
You know, it's interesting about the elderly. I'm not exactly elderly, but I'm in the over 50 category at 57. People in America over 50 own 80% of all the wealth in this country, and many of the wealthy, the elderly, in pretty good shape. But for those who are truly poor, there is adequate funding in America to take care of them, and we have to have, especially with long-term health care. That seems to be the #1 priority among the elderly. What happens about nursing home? And I want to make sure that not only do we have a program that's partially a private insurance system and partially government assisted to guarantee to the elderly that if they come upon some type of sickness, that there can be health insurance for long-term health care and also for in-home community health for them. Now, something else, though, that is more important for the younger generation and for the nation, we as a nation have got to save more money. The last tax bill was seriously flawed in one respect. It took away IRAs, which were just catching on and getting to be very popular. It limited the Keogh plans, and it limited the 401k retirement plans. We must put incentives back into the tax code to promote saving instead of spending. And there are a number of ways to do it, but the restoration of the full IRA benefits and the 401k retirement plans would be the top of priorities as far as I'm concerned. That looks long range for the future, and we've got to be thinking long range for all of us.
We've got more questions from our audience. Your name, sir?
John Sims.
And where are you from?
I'm a private investor from Georgia.
And your question?
Well, it's been said that it took Japan 40 years to win the Second World War through the trade deficit and the declining dollar. Would you comment on this?
You know, I was over in Japan, John, in 1951, and I was under the impression we'd won the war too. But you know what the Japanese began doing? They began saving at a rate of 17 to 20%. And now 7 of the top 10 banks in the world are Japanese banks. And the Japanese businesses, many of them are just awash in capital because of the enormous saving of the Japanese people. While they've been saving, we have the lowest saving rates since statistics have been kept. It's 2.8%, which is a shocking commentary on the profligate ways of America. While we're doing it, we'll pay, it seems, any price for Japanese automobiles or Japanese television or Japanese products. And so they're running about a $99 billion trade surplus while we're running about a $171 billion trade deficit. That's got to stop because the Japanese now own about 30% of all the outstanding federal securities in the world. And they have control over us, and we've got to do something about it. The best thing is make good products, get involved in exports, and do what we can to restore the greatness of American industry. There's no question working together we can make it together, and we can do it.
Your name, sir?
Lonnie Long.
And your question?
Pat, I would like to know what effect the economy is going to have over the next 5 or 6 years on the small businessman.
I think the biggest concern of the small business people in America is tort reform. I think that that comes #1. We've got to do something about the escalating costs of insurance. This type of malpractice insurance is putting many of the doctors out of business, and it's also putting many small businesses out of business. One of the things I'd like to see also is what's called a youth opportunity wage. We're talking about minimum wages, and people want to raise the minimum wage, but many of the youth are unemployable because they don't have any early training. We need a special opportunity at a lower wage for the young people. But the small businesses, we've got to get government regulations off their back. They have to be free to grow, and there are a number of ways to do it, but one of the best things we could do for small business is tort reform and to appoint judges who believe it's the role of a judge to interpret the laws in the Constitution instead of trying to rewrite them.
We'll be back with more with Pat Robertson right after this message. back to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. Now, we have had lots of good questions from our very business-oriented audience, but what about the average man or woman in this country? What do we have to look forward to?
You have to look forward to a very bright future if you do what John Kennedy advised us all to do in his inauguration in 1960, when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Unfortunately, we have become, in many areas, a nation of takers instead of a nation of givers. Over 50% of our people take something now from the federal government, and as long, and that's wrong. So what we've got to come to is a time when we believe that independence and thrift and hard work are virtues that we get back to, and we've got to realize that the government is to be our servant and not our master. Government cannot ever create wealth. Wealth comes from the private sector. It comes from the farmers, and it comes from the steel workers and the coal miners and the small business people and the big corporations and all the people in our private economy. And so if all of us are looking always to take, then we'll have congressmen who look to that interest to try to get themselves elected. But you know, the definition of a politician is somebody who cares about the next election. Definition of a statesman is somebody who cares about the next generation. We've got to put statesmen in Washington, not politicians.
And perhaps businessmen as well.
Well, hopefully a little common sense business approach to things won't hurt. But really what we need is common sense. We don't need big theories. But folks, if you don't make the decision, those in the audience don't make the decision to vote right, what we're going to do is have ultimate problems that we can't live with, and it'll cost people jobs and a lot of suffering. Either that or we'll have a wonderfully strong economy.
Very well, Pat, I have learned quite a bit from you today and from some of these wonderful questions. I want to thank our audience for all the great questions they had, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
We hope